Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to dive in.
Great. Well, today we're going behind the scenes, taking a look at how judges think. I think this will be especially interesting because it's something most people don't really consider too deeply.
It's true. Most of us only really think about judges when we see them on TV or if, well, we end up in court ourselves.
Exactly. But they have a huge impact on all of us. Their decisions shape our laws, our rights, pretty much everything.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to understand how they think, what factors influence their decisions.
I think most people have this kind of simplistic view of judges, like they're just robots who apply the law without any personal feelings or biases.
Yeah, like that whole judges are like umpires analogy, just
Okay.
calling balls and strikes totally neutral.
Right, exactly. But is it really that simple?
Well, if you've ever actually read a legal case or tried to understand a particular law, you quickly realize that it's way more complicated than that.
You mean the law isn't always black and white? There's some gray area?
Oh, there's a lot of gray area. And that's where things get really interesting because that's where a judge's real power comes in.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
Tell me more about this gray area.
Well, imagine you're a judge, right? And you've got this case in front of you where the law isn't clear. There's no obvious precedent, no easy answer. What do you do?
I guess you'd have to use your best judgment.
Yeah.
But isn't that kind of subjective?
It is, and that's what's so fascinating about judging. Richard Posner, a federal judge for over 30 years and a leading legal scholar, wrote this amazing book called How Judges Think. And he talks about this idea of the open area of law. It's where judges basically have to act almost like legislators, making decisions that shape the law itself.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing. I mean, we all know judges have power, but I never thought of it like that.
Mhm.
So wait, if they're essentially making new law in these gray areas, wouldn't that open the door for them to just, inject their own opinions and biases?
It's a big question, right? Like, how do we know they're not just deciding cases based on their personal beliefs?
Ex-
And it's something Posner grapples with in the book. He says that judges aren't robots. They're human beings with their own experiences and worldviews.
But how can we be sure they're not letting those personal views cloud their judgment?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. He dives into something called the attitudinal model, which basically argues that a judge's personal views, their ideology, their values, can actually play a role in their decisions, especially in those open areas of law we were talking about.
So it's like, even if a judge is trying to be impartial, their own background, their own worldview might be coloring how they see the case.
That's the idea. He uses this great analogy. I love this one. Imagine you and I are looking at a piece of abstract art. One of those paintings that's all shapes and colors. We might interpret it completely differently based on our own experiences, our tastes, our preferences. Well, judges are doing something similar with the law. They're looking at these complex questions, and their own background acts like a filter, shaping how they interpret the evidence and the arguments.
That's a great analogy.
Mm.
But if that's true, wouldn't that make the whole legal system seem, I don't know, unfair? Like, if a judge's personal beliefs are swaying their decisions, isn't that basically just bias in a fancy robe?
That's a concern a lot of people have, yeah. But Posner says it's more nuanced than that. He distinguishes between something called political judging and something called partisan judging.
What's the difference?
Well, political judging, he says, is kind of inevitable to some extent. He means that a judge might lean liberal or conservative in their overall philosophy. Their decisions might reflect those leanings in a subtle way.
Okay, but that's different from,
Right. That's different from what he calls partisan judging, which is what we usually think of as bias, like favoring one side simply because of their political party.
so a judge might have their own political leanings, but they shouldn't be letting those leanings influence their decisions in a specific case.
Right. And Posner argues that most judges actually take that distinction really seriously. They see themselves as guardians of the law, not political operatives.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I'm still wondering if this attitudinal model is accurate. Like, if a judge's background really does influence their decisions, does that make the legal system seem kind of, well, I don't know, unpredictable?
I think it's safe to say that it adds a layer of complexity, that's for sure. But Posner argues that even though a judge's background might play a role, there are still other factors that constrain them. He talks about things like precedent, the respect for the legal process, the need for predictability in the law. These are all things that limit a judge's discretion, even those with strong political views.
So it's not like they can just go rogue and make whatever decision they want.
Right. There are checks and balances in place, like the appeals process. And remember what we talked about earlier, the concept of constrained
I
pragmatism.
don't mind.
Posner argues that good judges are pragmatists, meaning they want to find practical solutions that work in the real world. But they're also constrained by the law, by precedent, by the need to be fair and impartial. It's a constant balancing act.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how this whole judging thing is a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Oh, absolutely. And we're just getting started. There's so much more to unpack.
Well, I'm definitely hooked. I can't wait to delve deeper into all these fascinating ideas.
Me too. There's so much more to explore.
Great. Well, after a quick break, we'll continue our deep dive into how judges think. We'll explore more of Posner's ideas about intuition, legal pragmatism, and the complex factors that shape judicial decisions. Okay, so before the break, we were talking about how a judge's background can subtly influence their decisions.
Yeah, it's called the attitudinal model, and it's one of the things that makes judging so complex and interesting.
I mean, it makes sense in a way. We all have our own biases and experiences that shape how we see the world. But I'm still struggling with the idea that a judge's personal beliefs could be affecting their decisions in court.
It's a valid concern. I mean, think about it this way. Two people can look at the same evidence and come to completely different conclusions, right? Because their interpretations are shaped by their own experiences, their beliefs, their values.
Right, sure. That happens all the time in everyday life.
Exactly. And judges are no different. They're human beings, not robots. And their decisions, especially in those tough cases where the law isn't crystal clear, are going to be influenced by their own background.
Okay, but doesn't that make the legal system seem kind of, I don't know, subjective, unreliable? Like, how can we have faith in the system if it all comes down to the personal opinions of the judge?
That's where Posner's idea of constrained pragmatism comes in. He argues that good judges are pragmatists, meaning they want to find practical solutions that actually work. But they're also constrained by the law, by precedent, by their ethical obligations.
So they can't just go around making whatever decisions they feel like.
Nope. There are limits. They have to consider the law, the facts of the case, and precedent. They have to be impartial. But within those constraints, they have some leeway to use their judgment, their experience, their intuition.
So it's like they're walking a tightrope. They have to balance their own views with the need to be fair and impartial.
Exactly. And that's what makes judging such a challenging and fascinating job. It's not just about blindly applying the law. It's about understanding the law, the facts, the context, and then using your judgment to reach a decision that's both legally sound and practically effective.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this whole thing is a lot more nuanced than I initially thought. But if we know that a judge's background can influence their decisions, shouldn't we be more careful about how we choose judges in the first place?
Absolutely. And that's one of the big questions Posner raises in the book. Should we elect judges or appoint them? What are the pros and cons of each approach?
Well, electing judges seems more democratic, right? Like,
Mm.
shouldn't the people have a say in who interprets the laws that govern them?
That's a common argument in favor of elections. The idea is that elected judges are more accountable to the public. They have to answer to the voters.
But wouldn't that also make them more susceptible to political pressure? Like, wouldn't they be tempted to rule in favor of whatever's popular, even if it goes against the law?
It's a valid concern. Critics of judicial elections argue that they can turn judges into politicians, more worried about getting reelected than about upholding the law.
And wouldn't that undermine the whole idea of an independent judiciary?
Mm-hmm.
One that's free from political influence.
Exactly. And that's one of the main arguments in favor of appointing judges, especially for federal judges who have lifetime appointments.
But lifetime appointments, doesn't that create a different problem? Like, what if a judge becomes out of touch or makes bad decisions or, well, just isn't doing a good job? How do you hold them accountable?
Well, that's where the impeachment process comes in. But it's a very high bar to remove a federal judge from office.
So it's kind of a trade-off, isn't it? With elections, you have more accountability, but also more potential for political influence. With appointments, you have more independence, but also less direct accountability to the public.
It's a tough balancing act. And there's no easy answer. Posner doesn't come down firmly on one side or the other. He just lays out the arguments and lets the reader decide.
Well, I'm leaning towards appointments. I think it's important for judges to be free from political pressure. But I can see the other side of the argument, too.
It's a complex issue for sure. But I think one thing everyone can agree on is that we need judges who are smart, fair, impartial, and committed to upholding the law.
Agreed. But how do we find those judges? And how do we ensure that they're representing the diverse perspectives of our society?
That's another big question, and it's one that Posner addresses in the book. He talks about the importance of diversity on the bench, not just in terms of race and gender, but also in terms of background and experience.
So having judges who have worked as prosecutors, public defenders, corporate lawyers, academics, people who have seen the law from different angles.
Exactly. Because that diversity of experience can bring a wider range of perspectives to the bench, which can lead to more nuanced and informed decisions.
It's like having a more well-rounded jury, but on a much larger scale.
I like that analogy. And Posner argues that this kind of diversity is crucial for ensuring that the judiciary is truly representative of the people it serves.
So it's not just about fairness and representation. It's about improving the quality of justice itself.
Exactly. It's about making sure that the law is applied fairly and impartially to everyone, regardless of their background or beliefs.
This whole deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexity of the judicial system.
It's definitely more than just banging a gavel and saying case closed.
That's for sure. Well, I'm eager to hear more of Posner's insights. What else does he have to say about how judges think? All right, so we've talked about intuition, we've talked about personal beliefs, we've talked about pragmatism. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, but it still feels kind of abstract.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about these concepts in theory, but it's another to see how they actually play out in the real world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does this all come together in, like, a real case?
Well, Posner gives a bunch of really fascinating examples in the book. One that I think illustrates this really well is his discussion of statutory interpretation.
Statutory interpretation. You mean like how judges interpret the laws that are passed by legislatures?
Exactly. You see, sometimes laws are written in a way that's, well, kind of vague or ambiguous.
I can imagine that happening. I mean, laws are written by humans,
Yeah.
right? And we're not exactly known for being perfectly clear and precise all the time.
Right. And sometimes it's intentional. Maybe the lawmakers couldn't agree on the specific language, or maybe they just couldn't foresee every possible situation that might arise.
So they leave it to the judges to figure it out.
In a way, yeah. When the law is unclear, it's up to the judges to interpret it, to figure out what it actually means in a specific case.
But how do they do that without just injecting their own personal opinions? I mean, wouldn't that make the whole system seem arbitrary?
That's where Posner's idea of a constrained pragmatist really comes into play. He argues that good judges use a variety of tools to interpret statutes in a way that's both legally sound and, well, pragmatic.
Okay, what kind of tools?
Well, for one thing, they look at the legislative history.
You mean like what were the lawmakers trying to achieve when they wrote the law?
Exactly. What was their intent? What problem were they trying to solve? They also consider the potential consequences of different interpretations. What would this decision mean for society as a whole? And they try to choose the interpretation that leads to the most just and practical outcome.
So it's not just about finding the right answer in some legal textbook. It's about understanding the bigger picture, the purpose of the law, the effects it will have.
Precisely. And Posner gives all these fascinating examples of how judges have done this throughout history. Cases involving everything from environmental protection to intellectual property to civil rights.
It's amazing to think that judges have this much power to shape our society.
They absolutely do. And that's why it's so important to understand how they think, what factors influence their decisions. It's about ensuring that they're using their power responsibly. It's about making sure that the legal system is fair and just for everyone.
Well, I have to say, this whole deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how judges approach their role, the challenges they face, the factors that influence their decisions. It's definitely more complex than I ever imagined.
I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from Posner's book. It demystifies the judicial process. It shows us that judges are human beings, they're not infallible, but they're also not just robots blindly applying the law. They have to grapple with complex issues, they have to make tough decisions, and they have to do it all within the constraints of the legal system. It's a balancing act, but it's a vital one for our democracy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey. It's been a fascinating exploration of a topic that's both complex and, well, incredibly relevant to all of us.
It's been my pleasure. Hopefully, our listeners have a few new things to ponder about the role of judges in our society.